persecution, and where to be a church member often means to gain rather than lose respectability, particularly at the local level, cultural Christianity makes sense. But the shocking argument of this book is that cultural Christians could exist and even flourish in a world in which Christianity was a persecuted minority. Indeed, the first empire-wide persecution of Christians was taking place just as the beleaguered bishop of our first example, Cyprian, who was eventually martyred for his faith, was exhorting his flock, including the poorly behaved consecrated virgins, to resist their surrounding culture. Furthermore, cultural Christianity could exist also in a world in which Christianity had just recently become the legalized religion of the empire, as in the case of Ambrose. Instead of thinking of cultural Christianity as the exception, a phenomenon that could only flourish in very specific kinds of conditions, perhaps we should think of it as a default, a natural result of the fallen and sinful state of humanity. And so, this book, which aims to be both historical and practical, argues that cultural Christians were the norm, rather than the exception, in the early church, from the 1st century CE to the 5th century CE. Using different categories of culturally inspired sins as its organizing principle, and focusing on a different sin in each chapter, the book considers the challenge of culture to the earliest converts to Christianity, as they struggled, and often failed, to live on mission in the Greco-Roman cultural milieu of the Roman Empire. Why I wrote this book. I wrote this book for 3 related historical and theological reasons, and these 3 reasons are also the reasons why you should listen to it. First, as a professor of ancient history who has been teaching for over a dozen years now at a state university in a predominantly evangelical region of the American South, I have heard too many of my students and fellow churchgoers over the years make comments about the superiority of early Christians to us. This book is an attempt to explain both why this view is wrong and why holding this belief can end up misleading us in the present. Second, and related, both the American public at large and American Christians in particular have a very limited understanding of ancient history and the world of the early church. Particularly lacking is an accurate understanding of Greco-Roman culture and its responsibility for shaping people's worldview, which means also shaping the sins to which they were particularly prone. And third, if we understand the presence and impact of cultural Christianity in the early church, and understand that so many of our own sins are cultural sins, this will have an impact on everything, including our views on finances, marriage and sexuality, and politics, to name just a few examples. Because if so many of us, too, are cultural Christians, then trying to fix the world through politics or just through particular policies on marriage, for instance, will never work. Rather, we need to pursue genuine conversion and sanctification. In defining cultural Christianity, I noted that it is the faith of those who are confessing Jesus with their words while living by the standards of the surrounding culture. Those culturally normalized behaviors of cultural Christians become, in turn, what I refer to as cultural sins. Put simply, cultural Christians commit cultural sins whenever they bypass God's standards to engage in certain culturally conditioned and approved behaviors. These might be so common that the surrounding culture considers them utterly normal, perhaps not even deserving commentary, like the mixed-gender nude public bathing of the sacred virgins to which Cyprian objected, or the modern American attitude toward cohabiting before marriage. And yet the New Testament presents a countercultural view of such everyday subjects and many others. In the dissonance of the gospel teachings with those of the surrounding culture, we find culturally inspired sins. Focusing on these culturally inspired sins, in turn, allows us to consider which aspects of the surrounding Greco-Roman culture were particularly challenging for early Christians to overcome. We will meet, for instance, men and women who relied entirely on Greek and Roman ideals of patronage in thinking about how to use their money.